Hello there. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is you're watching, and welcome to a video of a story that I wanted to share with the world, which, as the title suggests, is about me upgrading my PC to Intel's 11th gen platform, the 11 series of the Core i series, as I upgraded from my Ryzen 5 2600 and B350 motherboard CPU combo as I had, and well, it was I got into the effect of you can't upgrade your GPU now, so upgrade other components of your system just to feel better and feel like you're actually upgrading. And yeah, I got caught up in that, but some interesting things came out of this whole situation and this upgrade. And again, I wanted to share it with the world because I found this whole thing very, very, very interesting. With some crazy twists and some things to be learned from my experience. So, why don't we start? Well, of course, starting is when I got myself my motherboard and CPU. I decided to go with the Core i5-11400F. The F variant is the one that doesn't have a graphics card on the CPU, an integrated GPU. And it was cheap, it was good value, so I decided to go with that. And as for my motherboard, that needed a lot of research, if I'm honest, because the B560 motherboard and even the Z690, Z590, I think it's the Z series motherboard like that is within 11th gen. There's a lot of things going wrong with both of those motherboard series, and it was nuts to figure out how much stuff needed, how careful you need to be when purchasing an 11th series motherboard compatible motherboard. And yeah, it was pretty interesting. I almost actually bought a motherboard that was deemed pretty garbage. It was the Asus Prime B560M, B560K, I think, or B560A. But after looking at some reviews, thank you so much, I would say, to Hardware Unboxed for their amazing, motherboard reviews. I figured out that that series of motherboards, they are totally trash, like exceptionally trash. So, unfortunately, I was going to go with a Gigabyte one, the Aorus Pro, I think, the B560 one, at around 130 euros. But the damn thing became unavailable the day I wanted to purchase it, and yeah, that was sad because that was actually one of the best motherboards that they tested. And unfortunately, with what I could afford and what was available, because holy shit, there aren't that many B560 motherboards available that are actually good looking, good on features as well, I ended up with the ASRock B560 Pro 4. Now, in that video, Hardware Unboxes video, you will see that the B560 Pro 4, B560M Pro 4 aren't all that great, but they are acceptable. They have problems with the power limits on the CPUs, but those are easily replaceable. You can easily remove those power limits and have the CPU run at basically full speed. And in this case, the B560M Pro 4, it seems to actually consume less power and still boost to the right amounts. I have done plenty of benchmarks, I've played lots and lots of games that stressed the CPU, and frequencies were normal, 4.2 gigahertz at 100 watts, and I was like, okay, interesting. Though I was getting a few spikes to 4.2, 4.3, and I was like, why can I not get those clocks always, sustained? But 4.2 gigahertz is the max rated frequency of the 11400. So then, I decided on those parts. They were nice aesthetically, they had the features I wanted, and the motherboard worked finally with the power limits removed. Not the best, but again, what was affordable and what was available. Yeah, so I get the parts, and I start building my computer. I also want to say I am a PC enthusiast. I don't waste tons of money on PC parts. No, I'm not rich, but I'm an enthusiast. I know how to troubleshoot. I know lots and lots about computers. I understand software very well, like, the tech guy of the family that everybody calls to you is like, this is broken, or I want to do this. Like this morning, I had my sister call me and it's like, what screws do I remove on this specific laptop to clean my fan? And I'm like, that's interesting. Don't you have eyes? Can't you see which screws are holding the fan? And how the heck am I supposed to know this specific laptop and what screws, the fan is holding? But, I'm the tech guy of not just family, friends and everybody. I had a friend recently that had problems with his GPU drivers, and it turns out that a reputable brand, like a reputable store that sells electronics here, sold him a fake graphics card. Like those on Wish that say they're 1050 Ti's, 1060s, 3060s, and then they're like GT 550 Ti's or something, GTX 550 Ti's. That reputable store sold him a 750, non-Ti, 750, and it actually is a 650 Ti that he said, like, I can't install newer drivers, it crashes and such. And I'm like, why don't you download GPU-Z and see if that shit's, if it says fake. So that's another interesting tidbit to add to this video. So yeah, I had gone to his place to check his GPU actually a few times, and I was like, your 750 needs a 6-pin? Like, it has a 6-pin connector. Your 750, the thing that only needs 75 watts. I'm like, how? And then GPU-Z said everything. Like when I saw the power connector back then, I was like, the fake GPUs thing wasn't as known. And also it's like a reputable brand, a reputable store, that one of the biggest stores that sell electronics and things that I've bought from them. I've bought things from that store. And like, I just couldn't believe that they had done that. That was plenty of years ago, but they still were big a few years ago. So that's interesting. But nevertheless, I am good at tech. That's the whole point of that tangent. I'm good with tech, let's say. And so I get the parts. I got them pretty quickly, 1 to 2 days max. Pretty nice. And I start building the PC. Everything goes well. No problems at all. I set everything up. Motherboard is perfectly fine. CPU is fine. Everything is good. I turn on my PC. I do stuff, drivers for the Intel motherboard. I did a BIOS upgrade as well. After other things, like I turned off my PC. I don't know why I didn't restart my PC necessarily. Most likely I needed to tinker with something either inside of the computer itself, or a program had asked for a shutdown. I'm not so sure. Maybe I wanted to do a BIOS upgrade, and then I said, let me turn off the PC instead of restarting it and then, spamming delete. But I turned off the PC, and then press the power button to turn it back on, and it doesn't. And I'm like, oh, well, this is interesting. The PC isn't turning on. Multiple presses on the button, I'm like, doesn't turn on. So I'm like, okay, my power button is broken, I guess. I mean, it turned on the PC before, but I don't know. I open up the case, I unplug the power cable, and then I touch the pins I short the pins with a screwdriver, and nothing. Nothing happens, and I'm like, yeah, this is interesting. I turn off the PSU. This motherboard also has a RGB LEDs on it. I don't know who the heck would put RGB LEDs on a motherboard and just create, hotspots, because LEDs can get hot. I can see that it's still on. And when I turned off the PSU, they were also still on, because power needs to be cycled through capacitors and everything. And then after like 5 seconds, the RGB LEDs turned off, and I know that there's no power at all. Turn on the PSU, press the power button, or bridge the contacts with a screwdriver. There was no difference in the end, and the PC turned on. So I'm like, this is interesting. Was this a one-time thing or something? So without plugging in the power button, I turn off the PC and then try to turn back on. Nothing happens. So troubleshooting starts. I basically rip everything out as I try the replace like take out and replace one by one to see which component is wrong, the problematic one. I had already done a BIOS update to see if BIOS was the problem. And I also, ASRock motherboards have a thing called the deep sleep. This is an option in the BIOS that you can enable if you want to have no power on USB. If you have some RGB mice or just keyboards mice that have lighting on them, or other things like hard drive, external hard drives or anything. If you don't have this thing on, those things could remain on after shutdown. And so I'm like, maybe putting it into deep sleep will help with this power issue. Maybe it will first of all turn off the LEDs, because that's annoying in the night. And maybe this will force power to go away from the motherboard, and then it will actually allow me to turn the PC back on after shutdown. Maybe something like that, like power is still in the motherboard and then it doesn't want to turn on, something weird. I didn't know, I wasn't sure. But enabling that option, deep sleep, made it so that the PC wouldn't turn on unless I cleared the CMOS. So I was like, oh, this is weird. So with that, it feels like a motherboard issue, but I take everything out and then I start putting things in one by one. And then I made a rookie mistake that almost caused me to panic like hell. As I was putting things in, I forgot to plug in the 8-pin power to the CPU. Once I plugged things in, I don't think I even had the cooler on for the CPU because I wanted to test everything. I plugged in my GPU as well and connected one of my monitors so that I know if I would get a signal, if I would post with this configuration. I was touching the CPU as well to see if it was gonna get hot. I turn on the PC, and then I get no signal on the monitor. I'm like, oh god, is my GPU the problem? Right now I'm not getting any signal. Was that it? Like, connecting it to the Intel motherboard, because with the AMD system it was doing fine, right? Once I connected the to the AMD to the Intel motherboard and the CPU, I was like, did this motherboard just kind of kill my GPU, or my GPU just acted weird and it wouldn't allow my system to boot, and now it's not outputting a signal? Is my GPU dead? Am I completely fucked? And my GPU is a GTX 1080. I'm like, full on panic attack. I rip everything out again, and then I use my AMD parts, my Ryzen 5 2600 and my ASRock again, AB350M Pro 4. Actually, good motherboard with good reviews. I plug everything back in, and as I'm connecting the 8-pin power, I'm like, my muscle memory kind of hints me like I feel like I didn't do this motion when plugging everything back into the Intel motherboard. So I'm like, was I not getting a GPU signal? Was I not getting a display because I didn't plug in CPU power? That's interesting. I plug everything in with the AMD system and everything works. Finally, even the shutdown works. So I'm like, okay, most likely it was the 8-pin power. And so I plug everything back in with just everything. And then, I just couldn't figure out what was wrong. And especially in my panic with my GPU, thinking my GPU was, dying, I just couldn't exactly find out what was wrong, what was the problem with my with the system. Because I was like, everything works with the AMD system. My displays work. I can shut down everything with the displays, with both my monitors on, plugged into the GPU. Everything is working, so it must either be the motherboard or the CPU. It was also getting pretty late and tired and everything, so I was like, it must be something with the motherboard or the CPU. Most likely this motherboard seems, especially with the deep sleep thing, it seems that there's something perhaps wrong with the motherboard. So the next day, I had already, swapped parts out with my AMD system, and I was back running perfectly fine. I contact the store that I got the motherboard from. I tell them this and that, do you accept returns, replacements, anything? And they're like, yep, send it back, include a note with the issue detailed, and, we'll send it back to see if if the company will see if it's problematic, if the motherboard has indeed a problem. And that happens. I send it back to the store. After a day, it reaches the store, and then the store almost immediately sends it to the company, which is ASRock. And then, like 2 to 3 days later, I get a call from the store, and they tell me that, hey, the company said that the motherboard was indeed problematic, and so they sent in a new one, and I'm gonna send it to you. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. And then 1 day later, I received the motherboard. I was like, thank you. This was really good and quick service, both from the store and ASRock. So I was like, that's cool. They said the motherboard was problematic, so that's fine. That's awesome. I get the stuff back. I put the system back together, and the problem still persists. And I'm like, what the fuck is wrong? Like, am I that unlucky? And I got both 2 out of 2 motherboards being problematic with this specific issue. And then I start, ideas start running through my head. I'm like, is it the CPU then? Should I start contacting the store that I got the CPU from, because I had to buy them from separate stores? I'm like, could this be the CPU? It feels, this issue feels kind of specific with power not going on after shutdown, where I'm like, this doesn't necessarily feel like a CPU problem. And again, more like a power supply maybe, or motherboard problem. I know that my power supply is fine. It's a Cooler Master 650 watt power supply with, I think, an 80 plus rating. And it works perfectly on my AMD system. I'm like, is the CPU consuming more power than my AMD system? And then I'm like, no, my AMD system is also overclocked to 4 plus gigahertz, and it consumes around 110 to 125 watts. Like, it's the same or more than the Intel system, which always consumes around 100 watts under load. So I'm like, it can't be a power supply problem, I think. And again, especially if it just works on the AMD system perfectly fine. A few days pass, like 1 to 2 days pass, and I'm like, I'm thinking, and I'm like, do I just stay like this? Am I just unlucky? Like, almost a week had passed since I got the CPU, and I'm like, will the guys accept it? As a return. I try to find the return policies and anything, but I'm just there sitting like, do I want to go through the hassle of sending the CPU back, getting a CPU back, a new CPU, or going to someone to perhaps test the motherboard and CPU, like a big electronic store that has service, like they have service stations and such. And I'm like, will they accept a motherboard and CPU that I didn't buy from them? As a good heart move of, hey, I'm just gonna plug your stuff in and see if it works. I'm not going to issue any returns. You just don't have any spare parts, and you want to test it. That's what I was thinking. Then, like 2-3 days later, I get caught up in a YouTube, let's say, loop of watching videos about tech, about different stuff, of course. And then I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. I am a PC enthusiast. I cannot just sit around. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Did I get a bad motherboard again? Is the CPU the problem? What the fuck is wrong? I take everything out, and then it's only the 24-pin power, 8-pin power, and the CPU. I thought about everything. Could it be the pressure of my cooler? I have a Corsair H45 AIO cooler. I got that when I had my Ryzen system, and I know a 120mm AIO is kind of overkill for an AMD system, but the air cooler that I had, a Be Quiet Purox Slim 2, actually did not do a very good job of handling this overclocked Ryzen 5 for some reason. I don't know why, actually. It was AM4 compatible, but I don't know, it didn't have good airflow or something. But then I said, summer, especially where I live, is very harsh. There's a lot of moisture and everything in the atmosphere, so that can make temperatures go really high. And a tower cooler, an air cooler was going to struggle a bit. So I said, hey, let's get a water cooler, a 120mm AIO, and then like when I upgrade to anything more powerful, I won't need to care if it's going to be, if it's going to be enough to cool the new parts, because it is going to be. And, well, I will have to call out Corsair a bit on this, because their instructions for installing this specific water cooler, this AIO, on AM4 systems and LGA 1200 systems is bad. First of all, their AM4 instructions are completely backwards. They have the bracket that you're going to screw into the motherboard. They say use the outer holes for AM4. Joke's on you, I actually had to use the inner holes for AM4 when installing it into my Ryzen system. And it actually took me like half an hour of being like, is there something wrong with my motherboard being some sort of specific standard or anything weird? Right? I'm like, what's wrong? Why can I not use the outer holes to screw in my AIO plate? No, the instructions are completely backwards. So that was one thing for you, Corsair. The second one, they don't have any sort of instructions on how to install this water cooler, this AIO, on LGA 1200 sockets. There are no screws labeled as use this as LGA 1200. There are no instructions on what to use, like the instructions manual. There are no instructions on saying use this for LGA 1200. There was a small piece of paper for AM4. There was one which had a few specific things, and things were labeled for AM4, but not for LGA 1200. And I bought this cooler on summer of 2021, where LGA 1200 was already out. This was a new batch of these AIO coolers, so there's no excuse to not include instructions or label parts for what to use on LGA 1200. And the simplest thing, kind of, is that you need to tweak a few things about the mounts that you're going to be using, and they're the same as the LGA 775, 1136, I think it is, or 1366. God, there are so many weird LGA numbers. And then, of course, 1151, which was the previous one for 10th gen and lower. I used those parts, and they fit in perfectly. I had to freaking look up on Google for a YouTube video of a guy showing that, you can actually move the screws that would go on the back panel for the motherboard, and that would actually fit on LGA 1200. So that is a shot at you, Corsair. That is bad. And because of that, I was like, okay, this cooler maybe doesn't fit fully on LGA 1200, although the box says it is compatible. Maybe I need to, I put a bit too much pressure on the CPU, and because of that pressure, this issue was caused. Maybe pins were being shorter on the socket. I checked for bent pins. There were no bent pins. Everything was perfect on the socket. But I was like, maybe because of the pressure, something touched, something didn't go well, and this very weird and specific issue arose. And so I'm like, no cooler, just the CPU and power. I power my system on. I am touching my CPU to see if it gets hot. It starts getting hot, so I know that it is on. I turn off I press the power button. I did have the power button connected. And then I try to turn the system back on, and it does. So I'm like, oh, motherboard is fine then. CPU is fine then. So we didn't get, I guess I didn't get unlucky with the second motherboard or something. Or it was indeed the pressure of the cooler. Usually less pressure would cause problems, especially on something like the Intel system and how the pins are in the motherboard. But I'm like, maybe anything, right? Anything is a possibility to cause such a weird issue. Sure. And, because the AMD system works differently, where the pins are on the CPU instead of the motherboard, even if extra pressure was, if I had put some extra pressure on because of the cooler on the CPU, maybe that wouldn't cause a problem because, again, of how the CPUs are different and the sockets are different. Maybe that was the case, I say. So I get my AIO, thermal paste and everything, and I slightly screw in the AIO. Just barely, so that the plate is being held on the CPU. Just barely, so that, it puts a bit of pressure on the CPU so that, it touches the thermal paste as well. But also that it holds the AIO on the motherboard so that when I flip it on, when I flip it vertically, it doesn't fall off. And I power on the system. I of course plugged in my pump and fan. I turn off the system, and it works. Once again, I turned it off, turned it back on, and it worked. So I'm like, I more so say that, oh, I guess it was the pressure, I guess it was. And I start putting things back in. I connect my, SATA M.2 drive. I also tried other M.2 slots on the motherboard. Maybe PCI Gen 4 wasn't a thing for my NVMe SSD, and so it caused this problem with booting. I tried anything, but nothing would work. But, as we are now in the present, I plug everything back in, and then I plug in my GPU. I don't give it display, I just give it power through the power supply. And because I'm like, maybe it was the pressure on the CPU through the cooler, maybe it was the power supply and how power consumption or what this motherboard perhaps caused problems when excessive power was needed through the GPU or something. System on, system off, I press the power button and it works. So I know it's not power for the GPU, because I also thought if it was a PSU problem, it most likely would have failed under load when I was playing games and such. That's when the PSU would fail because it reached its power limits and it cannot deliver anymore. Yeah, everything works. So I plug in my sound card that I need for this microphone. I have a video on that if you're interested in how a sound card can improve a microphone and headset audio. I mean, I'm sorry, but I need to advertise the channel a bit. But yeah, I plug in my sound card because I'm like, maybe the sound card is the problem. You never know. Maybe it is asking for a lot of power through the motherboard, or its PCIe slot is doing weird things. Anything. I plug in the thing, I plug in the sound card, I also plug in my fans for my case, and then I also give my my GPU HDMI display out. I'm like, DisplayPort, I've seen a few videos, especially Jace2Sense has had a few troubleshoot things with DisplayPort. I'm like, maybe this, DisplayPort could be causing the problem, anything, or whatever. I turn on the system, I get display, I get into Windows, and I shut it down through Windows. I press the power button, and everything works. So, the idea of it being the pressure on the CPU still, goes further into, oh, that was it. But, I know it's not the sound card, it's not the GPU displaying anything, so we're actually good. We are getting to the bottom of this slowly. I plug out my HDMI, and then I plug in my DisplayPort monitor. Turn it on, I get an image, everything works, shut it down through Windows, and then I press the power button again, and it doesn't power on. And that, is where the hit comes in, where you're like, that's it? This is causing the problem? The DisplayPort out? Okay then. Take the DisplayPort out, and I plug it into a different like port on my GPU just to check if it is a problematic port on the GPU. You never know. On, it turns on, off through Windows, and it doesn't power on again. So I'm like, oh, okay then. So it's either something being caused by the cable, or perhaps the DisplayPort on the monitor. I plug out the DisplayPort cable and actually power on the system, and it does. So I'm like, okay, we are getting there. And so I do a bit of testing. I'm like, is it the monitor perhaps? I plug it in through HDMI, and no. Everything works. Powers on, powers off, powers on again through HDMI. So I know that it's either the cable or the monitor port. Unfortunately, this monitor doesn't have multiple display ports. It only has one, and then everything else is HDMI. So I couldn't test if it was a different port. I couldn't do that. So I rushed to the shops, and I get myself a new cable and also a DisplayPort to HDMI adapter, just to know, because like if it is the port on the monitor, I won't have to rush to the shops again and buy the adapter. So I buy a cheap adapter like to just work. I plug in the new DisplayPort cable and plug it into the monitor, on, off, and it does turn back on. So indeed, the problem, what was causing this problem of not giving power after shutdown, was the DisplayPort cable. And here is where things get a bit more interesting. A few days earlier after I discovered that, and not to throw any, no shade, but like not to throw the fault at anybody, Linus Tech Tips, of course, the famous Linus Tech Tips, they did a video on testing different DisplayPort cables. And they tested the cheapest ones, they tested the most popular ones, and they found out that most of them passed. Basically, all of the new ones passed. The cheapest on Amazon, it passed. And DisplayPort cables aren't that cheap, necessarily. But everything passed. So as I was watching that with my AMD system, as I was waiting for my motherboard, I was like, oh, I don't need to change my DisplayPort cable. I had a few, like thoughts that my DisplayPort cable was kind of bad. Not necessarily like causing any faults, because again, with the AMD system, it was working perfectly. But like a few, like a bit of like movement on the DisplayPort cable would cause problems on the monitor. But I'm like, that's normal. It's a losing connection. Like there shouldn't be any problems. Like that doesn't like show bad cable. And again, because of the video saying that most DisplayPort cables were good and they passed the test that they had, I was like, okay, I don't need to switch my DisplayPort cable, because I was like, it's been a few years, maybe the cable, has gone its age, or again, it's a bad cable because it was kind of cheap. But no, DisplayPort cables seem to be good, I said, after watching the video. But lo and behold, it was the DisplayPort cable causing this very specific issue. And this is where things, in this conclusion, is where things start like taking like things run through my mind, and I just cannot understand them. But there are three conclusions to be made. Number one is Corsair, please add some more instructions to your AIOs that have for the newer sockets. And if this AIO could perhaps work on LGA 1700, which I don't think so, add instructions for that. But please, release a new version or your new batches of this AIO. Like, it's a good cheap AIO, around $50. It's free water cooling, I would say. But please include instructions and change and check your AM4 instructions, because again, for me, the paper said outer holes for AM4, not inner holes. But it did not work on my motherboard. So I don't know what to say. The second conclusion, which is kind of a big one, isn't necessarily to, let's say, not trust ASRock. I had, amazing experience with their AB350M motherboard, which is right there. You cannot see it, but it is right there on the floor. The box is right there on the floor. It was like good cheap, 90 euros when Ryzen first came. It was the cheapest B350 motherboard for Ryzen, and for the system that it is targeted at, Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, and maybe Ryzen 7, it is perfectly fine. And it can run them overclocked perfectly fine. And it has good features. It has USB-C on the back. It has plenty of USB spots. It was perfect. So, I didn't necessarily fully trust ASRock, but I was like, I have had good experiences with them. So, I don't consider them like garbage tier. No. But the fact that I instantly know that most likely their like customer like returns thing, like they didn't test the motherboard at all. Which means like with this conclusion that the DisplayPort cable was the problem, it means that first motherboard was not problematic. It was not problematic, yet ASRock said it was problematic. Now, I don't necessarily know if perhaps the guy that I talked to, that had the store that sold me the motherboard, like, I don't know if he lied to me, that ASRock never told him that the motherboard was faulty and problematic. Like, I don't know why he would say the motherboard was problematic, but with the guess that ASRock was the one to say that, yeah, the motherboard is problematic, here's a new one, it's under your warranty, here you go. Here's the new one back. Here's the new one back. This caused me to have wrong perceptions and ideas for the problem that I got with the second motherboard. Because I thought I was, either I was very unlucky or something else was causing the problem. Like I said, my CPU. Those were my thoughts when I heard that, yes, the motherboard was problematic. Instead of my series of thoughts being something else in my system is causing this problem again, right? And then go to I got very unlucky with my motherboard, with my second motherboard. The series of thoughts was completely turned around because, again, ASRock said that first motherboard was problematic, so I know that the motherboard was causing this problem, and now the second motherboard is also causing the problem. If you're not going to test the motherboard at all, because if you did, you would have found out that there was no problem. Why not just say, hey, we're not going to test the motherboard. Here's a new one, right? It's under your warranty. We're not going to test it. Here's a new one. It's under your warranty. You're just getting a replacement. Done. Again, the series of thoughts when I got the new motherboard would have been, okay, something else is actually triggering this problem. It was not the first motherboard. Fine that I'm happy that I got a replacement and very quick, but at least I know that I need to search a bit more. I need to do my troubleshooting again. Maybe it is the CPU. No, I was told that it was problematic. So this is to you, ASRock. Your products are very much fine. The support that you gave me on a replacement motherboard very, very quickly was good. But the fact that you didn't do any testing, which is kind of fine, you just don't want to deal with a problematic motherboard or whatever, just, recycle it, even if it was good. But the fact that you told me that it was problematic and that was fake information, false information, I just cannot let you go through with that. So that's the second conclusion, that be careful of not just ASRock, plenty of companies will do that where they won't test anything. They just won't test your product, send you a new one, and that's it, right? So you may never know what was wrong with that motherboard, with a PC component that you sent back, or again, if they come back to you and say it was problematic, you just will be lost in thought, right? And then the third conclusion is, goddamn. How the fuck did a DisplayPort cable cause such a specific issue? Because this issue had to do with power. Yet a cable that isn't connected to the motherboard. I would be fine if I said that the DisplayPort cable was connected to the motherboard and it was directly causing a problem with the motherboard. Understandable. But it was connected to the GPU. And I'm like, how can this problem pass through the cable to the GPU, to the motherboard, to the power supply? To like you see how weird things turn around. And wait, give me a sec. This is the bad boy that was causing the problem. This is the DisplayPort cable. It doesn't have the locking mechanism, although that's not DisplayPort standard. And yeah, this was the thing that was causing the problem. Fuck that cable. Like, you know, at first, like in general thought, I'm like, okay, a cable was causing a power issue. That's fine. It's weird, and I don't know how exactly that happened. You know, how that would happen, but it was causing the problem. We know that. But then you dig in deeper, and I just get confused. Because I'm like, why didn't the AMD system cause this problem? Why was this DisplayPort cable not causing a problem when I was using my AMD system, but every time I connected it to the Intel system, it would? And that's where I'm so confused, and this is where I want you to participate. In the comments anywhere, I'm asking you, how the heck can a DisplayPort cable, faulty or whatever, aged? How can a DisplayPort cable cause such a specific issue where restarts were fine, sleep mode was fine, although the power button wasn't working after I put the PC on sleep mode. I needed to turn it on through an input through my keyboard. But again, restarts were fine. When I was updating the BIOS, for the motherboard, or when I was changing settings on the BIOS, the PC basically turned off to apply those settings, but then it would turn on again. So I'm like, why is shutting it down through Windows or pressing the power button after I reach Windows, like, why is it so specific? I don't know. So if you know, please, comment down below if you have experience with this and you figured it out better. I don't know. Again, maybe you have the answer on why it was not causing a problem with the AMD system, but it was causing a problem with the Intel system. Maybe it's haunted hardware. I don't know. It's a demon cable that hates Intel. It's an AMD spy. But yeah, if you don't know, please, I would absolutely love it if you shared the video to any tech forum sites where maybe we would get an answer from there. And this is, I have my hopes, let's say, but if this somehow reaches Linus or anybody in the tech space, or anybody that is close to, again, Linus, Jay, or anybody, but mostly Linus because they have the cable tester. Maybe the thing that we need to test isn't necessarily the new DisplayPort cables, but it's maybe degradation of DisplayPort cables. Maybe because they use more power than HDMI, maybe they degrade much faster, because this was a 1 to 2 year old cable. Maybe DisplayPort just degrades much faster, or just its degradation causes more problems than we know, or we can see clearly. It isn't clear that you'll get like problems in your display or something, but you'll get problems with your hardware just like I did. So that is it. Please leave a like and maybe subscribe. I need to do this because this is YouTube, and I seriously hope I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.